Welcome, everyone. I think we'll get going. This is Doc Talks, Racism and Trauma in the Workplace for Service Providers, a session that's being put forward by the Burnaby Primary Care Networks. My name is Jeff Malmgren, and I do some work supporting some of the community work that the networks take on. Today, we're going to have a bit of a presentation and a conversation really that's focusing on the impact of service providers of racism in the workplace, and obviously it's multifaceted. There's the impact on providers of racism that is directed toward them. Impact of providers are just on having to deal with racism and racist issues in the workplace directed toward others, to clients or to people to their own staff. Um, it's a very broad it's a very broad and emerging discussion that I know is happening in all workplaces. Today we're really lucky to have some folks who have some both direct experience and a tremendous amount of knowledge around this issue. Dr. Iram Yunus is from the Division of Family Practice, and Priya Patel is from Fraser Health. Unfortunately, Sangeeta Subramanian was unable to make it. She had a medical emergency that we really just heard about just 20 minutes ago. So, but both Iram and Priya will be able to give us answer your questions through the session well, I know it. So I do want to just take a moment to mention that although each of them will give a bit of a presentation, this really is about addressing the concerns that have been coming up for you. So please take the time to put your questions in the Q&A box. You can put them in now, you can put them in as you hear them. What we're really trying to do is ensure that you have an understanding of some of the resources that are available to you, and you'll hear about some of those through the presentations and also at the end, but also be able to understand what concerns that you have and the issues that are coming up for you as a teacher or a service provider, an agency worker, or someone working in healthcare, as you come up against racism in the workplace and for your clients, and try to give you some support and guidance that might help you work through that. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Priya to lead us off. Priya is a certified counselor with the Canadian Counseling and Psychotherapy Association. She holds a Master's of Counseling degree from Adler University, and she's been practicing since 2016. Priya is passionate about helping individuals identify and overcome the obstacles that prevent them from reaching their full potential. Her areas of specialization include helping clients with trauma and post-traumatic stress, relationships and attachment issues, depression and anxiety, addictions and substance use, self-esteem, body image, family conflict, and childhood trauma. So, welcome, Priya. I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, Jeff. Thank you so much for the introduction. The pressure is definitely on for me, I guess, after that. But thank you so much, everybody, for being here. I really appreciate your time. And this is obviously a very important topic, and I'm very honored to have the opportunity to speak about this topic. I wasn't supposed to go first, but such is life, I suppose. But I'm happy to have the opportunity to go first, because now I can take a little bit more time going through each of the slides that I prepared for today, and I won't have to worry about being too redundant or anything like that. So please feel free to jump on the chat box if you do have any questions. I know Andrea and Manny are going to be helping navigate that, and they'll let me know if anybody has any questions. But without further ado, let's just get into it. So I did prepare a couple of slides for our time together this afternoon. I won't be reading off of them too much. I do have my own notes as well, but if anybody would like these slides or would like to have access to some of the references that I used or any further additional reading at the end, please feel free to just let me know. I'd be happy to share that information. So I'm a clinical counselor. I work for the Primary Care Network in Burnaby. I will have the opportunity to speak a little bit further about our program and the type of work that we do here and the type of clients we have the ability to work with and serve. I'll talk about that in the middle of our presentation, just when we kind of, when it comes up in terms of what we're discussing and speaking to. But for now, we'll just kind of begin. So today we're going to be obviously talking about racial trauma at the workplace, what it looks like, and perhaps some ideas and strategies to navigate through it. So if, Andrea, if you don't mind, if we can swap over to the next slide, that would be awesome. So racial trauma is a form of race-based stress, and it affects people of color when they experience and witness dangerous events, perceived experiences of racial discrimination, and other events that can often come up in the workplace. And these events that we're referring to often sometimes can be on a larger scale, or they can be really subtle. And sometimes it can leave folks, wondering or curious around the interaction, something that they saw, or perhaps it's something that even happened to them directly. And they may wonder, is that what I think it is? Or, was that an experience of racism, or was it something else going on? And so those are the experiences that we're really looking to address and speak to in particular today. For many people, racial trauma can appear as threats or harm to their person, to another person, for example, humiliation, perhaps even the loss of certain opportunities, career advancements, promotions, all of those types of things. And of course, it goes without saying that these experiences can very negatively impact one's mental health. It can impact the person directly who's being affected. It can also impact many of the other staff in the workplace as well, whether they were a direct witness or if they came to know about it later, right? So obviously these experiences can be very detrimental and very triggering for many people. And the reason that we use the word trauma to associate with these experiences is because we've noticed, and the research indicates as well, that many people often carry these experiences with them for a really long time. When they go onto a new job perhaps, or when they hear of somebody else's experience, a lot of these memories often get activated as well. And these experiences that maybe happened a long time ago can seem very real and very present in the moments as well. So right now in the present day, just given everything that's going on in the world, the Black Lives Matter movement, which is nationally recognized, as well as more so in Canada and in the US, the Indigenous movement as well, as it continues to grow, as it continues to get a lot of attention, these topics are really coming more so to the forefront, right? After the deaths of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, to name a few people, there were so many, perhaps even many names that we don't even know. And in Canada, Joyce Equan, who passed away just a couple of days ago, she was an Indigenous woman in a Canadian hospital as well. These incidences are so real, and these are large-scale names, and these are large-scale stories that get a lot of attention. But a lot of stories that happen on a day-to-day basis, we don't really hear about those people that are affected, and that's what we're really here to talk about today. But people all around the world are demanding social justice for these experiences, as well as the collective experience of people of color as a whole as well. So that's why it's really important for us to talk about these things on this platform, as well as in the workplace, because these are topics that folks are really passionate about, and it really hits home for a lot of people as well. So, as a therapist, I do want to address the mental health implications that workplace trauma, particularly of the racial nature, can bring on for folks. And so often some of the symptoms that I hear reported from people are, some of the following. I'm going to read off of, some things I jotted down here. I hear folks talking about physical and behavioral symptoms that come up for them, sometimes even manifesting to pain in the body, tension in the neck and the shoulder. If people are clenching their jaw often due to stress, that kind of pain can come up as well. Behaviorally, it can show up in the way that people are interacting with one another, relationships, the way we're communicating with people, of course. Sleep problems, I hear this reported really often. People are so overwhelmed with some experiences that they're seeing or experiencing personally that it affects their sleep, their ability to rest and relax when they go home. Increased use of substance as well to cope with all of these difficult emotions. Exhaustion, anger, irritability, resentment, right? Those really heavy emotions that weigh down on us a lot are showing up as well. Shaken confidence in basic beliefs. We have this sense that the world is a good place, a safe place, as we should believe. But sometimes when these experiences happen, it really shakes those beliefs that we hold on to. And a diminished ability to feel safe, to trust other people, that's really a big one that I hear. A heightened sense of, vigilance or suspicion, right? When it happens once, you get this sense that it could happen again. A distrust of people in general, as well as an increased risk of depression and anxiety. Obviously, that's a really big one. So this is a very real phenomenon, and as we can see, the effects on mental health are really profound, which is why it's so important for us to be having these conversations. We can go on to the next slide, Andrea. Thank you. Or Mary, sorry. So what we're here to really talk about right now are the micro and macro aggressions that perpetuate racism and stereotypes and oppression, right? So over here on the slide, you can see that I have quoted Dr. Hayward Stewart. She's a psychologist based in New York, and she talks about this idea of workplace racial trauma and what it really sort of looks like. And, it's easy to obviously notice the really big things, right? If something is extremely obvious and very blatant, that obviously comes to our awareness as well, if it's something systemic or it involves many people, right? Obviously that stands out to us. But what I want to talk about more so today is those microaggressions, the more things that are subtle, maybe body language or a phrase that's used over the phone or on an email. Those are the things that, typically we have a tendency to overlook or perhaps not really give a lot of attention or importance to. And I really want to focus in and hone in on those things today, right? So these micro and macro aggressions, like I said, can happen over email, over the phone, it can happen in the sense of opportunities that are missed, promotions that someone is looked over for, all of those types of things. And communication is obviously so important in the workplace. It's very important irrespective of what field you're in, right? But sometimes it can be hard to exactly interpret someone's tone or their choice of words, right? We may not know, did this person mean to say this, or did they kind of mean something else, or maybe I misunderstood. Maybe it's me. Maybe I didn't understand things properly, right? But this is what I want to draw all of our attention to, is that these feelings that we have, these senses of doubt or confusion or lack of clarity that often come up for us, these are typically signs that a form of racism or experience of racism has occurred. And that's really what I want to talk about today is, these experiences can come up, right? So Dr. Hayward Stewart, she says that if something feels off, or if you kind of have an inkling about it, or if you find yourself thinking that kind of felt weird, that's really a strong indicator that some form of trauma is happening. But the good thing is nowadays people are feeling more comfortable and more able to talk about all of these types of things that are coming up, be it the person that's experiencing the racism themselves or other folks in the workplace. Right, that's one good thing that I've really seen in the research, as well as from conversations that I've had with clients as well, that, because people have access to information more easily through social media, the internet, YouTube, all these types of things, people are really able to be more quick about jumping in and building that community of support, which is so important. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later on as well, but we can jump over to the next slide. So we obviously know that racism is happening, that it is happening in our workplaces. In some places it's more subtle than others, but what can we kind of do about that? How can we as service providers help our clients who are experiencing these issues? How can we as colleagues who are either experiencing racism ourselves or witnessing it through other colleagues, how can we act as allies? How can we be the best support people that we can be? So, of course, we have a responsibility to educate and inform ourselves as much as possible, right? As service providers, when I was in graduate school, there was this common phrase that was tossed around a lot, and I'm surprised that I'm repeating it now, but I'm going to because it's so relevant. But, we can't rely on our clients to educate us, right? That's not the relationship, and that's not an expectation that we can have. So we do have a responsibility as social service providers to stay on top of things, right? I would even go as far as to say, and this is a personal opinion of mine, and not everybody perhaps shares it, but I really do believe that as clinicians, as frontline workers, as social service workers, we have an ability to do work that is actively anti-racist, right? Be it with our clients, be it in our communities, whatever it is, we have that responsibility. And it is something really important for us to really take on. And like I said, we can't really rely on our clients to educate us. So that does mean we need to kind of do our due diligence to stay informed, be it through the news or whatever kind of information outlet you rely on. It is very important so that when people are coming to us, when they're speaking out about these concerns, we can be as helpful to them as possible. Right? So, and that information also helps us be able to understand them better and understand where they're coming from, right? So there's two strategies that I'm going to suggest to you for how we can support folks who are experiencing racism in their workplace. The first is, encouraging them to really seek professional support. It's so important. And this can be said for a lot of challenges, but particularly trauma, particularly racism. right? Now that we have an understanding of what's going on, we can encourage people to seek therapists, perhaps even, people of color, therapists of color who can better understand their experiences as well can be very helpful. Someone who understands corporate Canada, the corporate culture, and understands how these micro and macro aggressions can really show up in the workplace. That can all really make a big difference. And all of this, as a whole, can really help clients better process their experiences, feel like they have a safe place to talk about things that are going on, and most importantly, be able to kind of move on in a way that's healthy and helpful, right? Those two things are so important. So I do want to speak about our program and the program that I am a part of, and I hope that this is good information for all of you to be able to share with your clients in the community as well. But on the next slide over here, we talk about the primary care network and the mental health counseling program. So this is a new program. It's accessible to clients who do live in Burnaby. And if you folks who are part of this presentation today have clients who are living in Burnaby, I would really encourage you to, encourage them to take advantage of these opportunities, be it, if it's workplace racism or other mental health concerns as well. This is available to anybody facing mild to moderate mental health challenges. So I've listed on here some of the requirements as well as nuances of our program here. So in order for a client to be referred to our program, they do need to be a Burnaby resident and also be connected to a Burnaby GP. So folks that are referred to our program have access to short-term counseling. It's individual, and we typically are able to see them for 4 to 6 sessions, depending on the nature of their situation. And our services are at no cost if the referral does come from their doctor. And so if you do have clients who you are working with who are facing these challenges, like I said, or other challenges, encourage them to reach out to their GP in Burnaby. A lot of the GPs are very familiar with our programs now, and we've been getting tons and tons of referrals as well. But ask them to just reach out to their doctor, let them know to ask for the mental health counseling program, and their doctor will know what to do in order to make this referral happen. So I'm sure there's going to be more questions about this component specifically about referrals and the program. So if you have questions about that, feel free to send a message in the chat, and I'd be happy to speak to that as well. So this is an option, if you do have clients who are struggling with trauma and racism in their workplace, encourage them to reach out, encourage them to get connected and to get that professional support. The earlier that they're able to access the support, the bigger difference that it really can make. So it is very important. We can go on to the next slide over here as well. So the second thing that's so important, other than therapy, obviously that's the first thing, is to really foster and build a culture of community. And that can really mean different things. But in the workplace, what it can look like is us kind of showing up as allies for our clients, us showing up as allies for our colleagues, right? And just feeling comfortable and able to speak up if we see something that's not really right, or talking to the person that's impacted directly, right? And just letting them know that they are seen, that they are heard, that their experiences are not just kind of going over our head. And the same can be said in working with clients directly, right? We want them to feel heard. We want them to feel like they're seen and that their troubles are being understood. And in the culture of community, that's equally as important as well. And, being part of that culture of community as well just means that, understanding what's going on and being able to show up when we really need to show up. And, I pointed out in the slide here that this is really going to look different for every person. And it's easy for us to be here and have this conversation and talk about showing up and being there and supporting people. But obviously, I know in the moment it's not that easy. But, we need to encourage folks to be able to start doing so, right? When we see something wrong that's happening, being able to step up and being able to address it right then and there in the moment. And that experience, that culture of community is what I'm really talking about here. And we want to encourage that to be built up as much as possible in our workplaces. And so, of course, we might wonder, how can we really go about doing that? How can we build a culture of community? Well, in the next slide here, I've listed a couple of ideas that maybe we can turn towards or look at, right? And so the best thing that we can also do as workers and as allies as well is just to reach out, right, and really do that active listening piece. And that doesn't mean listening to respond necessarily, but listening to hear and be able to empathize, right? Those are two very different things. And when we're wanting to support somebody, we do want to listen to actually hear what's going on, so we can, get a sense. And We don't necessarily need to respond or try and fix the problem, because the reality is sometimes we can't, right? But just being able to support that person, and without trying to resolve the problem necessarily, but still being able to be supportive is so important. We want to encourage folks to reach out to the right people, right? I find that often racism does happen in the workplace, but it can really lead to this a bit more of a toxic culture in the workplace by promoting a lot of gossiping, a lot of talking behind people's backs, and we want to avoid that, right? We want to move down a road where we're more supportive and more proactive. So we want to encourage folks to be able to talk to the right people, right? If they're involved in a union, perhaps maybe their union or their direct manager, right? If they have a GP that they can reach out to, or a therapist, or a work program that's in place, right? We want to encourage folks to be able to reach out to these resources that can actually be helpful. It's so important to be patient with folks as well, right? What I find is so particularly important is that sometimes the way that people respond initially may likely not be the way that they feel about the issue in the long run. So just giving people time to really process things slowly, get all their ducks in a row, so to speak, for themselves first, and then being able to kind of support them in that timely manner. And learning for ourselves, this is a very personal thing, how to be an ally and what it really means for us, what it really means collectively, right? And that's not something that I really can speak to. This isn't something that necessarily can be taught per se. It's more so intuitive. It's an experience that we need to embrace, right? That work of being an ally and figuring out how we can be the best support that we truly can be. So that's kind of all that I had for all of us today, this afternoon. Just my two suggestions in terms of how we can be as supportive as possible. So if anybody has any questions, be happy to speak to them. Thank you for your time, and thank you for listening. And I'll pass it back over to Jeff.
Thanks, Priya, and I hope you'll stay on. I actually have there are a couple of questions, and I have questions. It was great. That was really, I really appreciated that. One of the things you talked about was that anti-racism, and I want as you were talking, I was thinking about it from a provider point of view, and that particularly when you talk about those microaggressions, sensing it and seeing it in the workplace or with clients. And I think that sometimes we find ourselves in this uncomfortable place where we sense it and see it. And first of all, there are the people who are being who are being victimized. But then, how do we effectively deal with the aggressors? Is there a role we need? I mean, and if we're really trying to create a culture that's a non-racist culture, I mean, what role can we take as service providers that won't inflame the situation, but will actually address the situation? Is that the kind of question that you could think about?
Yeah, I think that's the question, right? That's the reason that we're here. That's the reason that we're having these conversations. Is for us to just recognize, and we already know that it's a problem. It goes without saying that racism exists, even in this day and age, and it's not something that we can ignore at the point that we're at right now. And I think what it really comes down to is just an ability to stay informed, like I was saying before, and just being able to kind of help folks do some cognitive restructuring to the best of our ability, right? Whatever is in our capacity to be able to empathize with people and understand where they're coming from. We don't necessarily need to be disrespectful all the time. It's not about confronting someone necessarily always, but just about letting them know that, hey, you know what, this isn't appropriate. This isn't right. And, as a therapist, I always encourage my clients to get out of that black and white thinking, right? We want to get out of that black and white thinking because, the world has shown so many shades of grays. But what I will say about this point, about racism, because it's personal to me and something that I'm very passionate about, is that unfortunately with racism, there really isn't that gray area. It's really black and white here. And, I'm surprised to hear myself saying that because I'm so against that way of thinking in general. But here, there's a right and a wrong. And unfortunately, in this day and age, racism is not appropriate. And we need to do our best to kind of reinforce that, right? Have these conversations where we can just, understand and explain this, that, this is kind of a way that we can be. And if we have problems and challenges, there is an appropriate way for us to be able to articulate that and communicate it. And there's also a way that's unfortunately just not appropriate. And the best that we can do to model that ourselves, I think that's really what it comes down to, right, Jeff? You were talking about as service providers, what can we do? the more that we can embrace that way of being, the more that we can model that ourselves. That's really the starting point.
And so, Ryan in the audience makes some points. So, and he kind of he makes that same point that you make, is that there's not a lot of gray. There's not gray area here. But I think the point that you made is that there's not gray area, but there may not be awareness. And I think Ryan makes that point too, is saying, I know you're a good person, but but that comment is racist or is so homophobic or whatever that may be. So is that an approach to be able to surface that and bring that forward? Is that a way to?
Looking at the chat, Jeff, so just give me a moment to catch up with you if you don't mind. I want to read what's been written here so I know what we're speaking to. Okay, so I see Ryan's point here. So there's no such thing as non-racist. We are either racist or anti-racist. Could say, I know you're a good person, but this comment behavior is racist, transphobic, etc. So call people into learning more. Yes, that is a good point. And I hesitate to kind of say that this is the only way that we can say it, or this is the right way to say it. I think the most important place, the place that we're at right now, is first we just need to say it, right? Yeah. In any way that feels comfortable to us, in any language that feels appropriate or helpful to us, right? We just need to kind of say it. If we see it, we need to say it. How we say it is I'll leave that up to interpretation right now personally, and I know some people have really strong and particular opinions about that, but I want to take us back a notch and say that the most important thing here is to show up and to speak about it, or if you see it happening, to call out, right?
And I guess that's, that kind of goes to your point around validation. If and obviously if there's a feeling as if you're a victim, and if someone who is either your teacher or your service provider doesn't speak to it in the moment, then that's invalidating. It's not. It goes to the point of an ally. What would an ally do in this situation? So I guess that's really kind of, it's the point that Ryan makes and that you're saying as well, is what's important is that you don't. And I think that's something that we all have. The struggle with is the uncomfortableness of it, and that I think you spoke to. Was that something I sensed, or was that something that didn't really happen, and then we stay silent, and that seems to be the worst thing. There's a couple of there's a question earlier on, an ask around this is more around the systemic side in the workplace, around what do you do if you're, and this person, so if you're a person of color and you find in your workplace that that everybody, all the people of color are being grouped in one department or one group. If you feel like, I guess the way I see that is, if you see systemic racism in your organization, what can you do about that? And I guess my question is what's the impact of that on the organization?
Mm-hmm. And those things are very real. They are happening. They happen often in every industry. That's the thing about racism, is that it impacts every field equally. No one field is separated from it or doesn't experience the challenges, right? It's showing up for everyone. And I guess there's this idea, this concept in the psychology community and social justice community at large, about speaking truth to power. Right, one of my profs, Vicki Reynolds, who I really idolize, you guys can look her up online. She has a great website. I'll type her name out so you have it. She speaks about this concept. She has a lot of articles that she's written about speaking truth to power. And this is something that's not easy. I really want to clarify that, and I said this before as well, we can have these conversations here in this safe space, but when we're actually put in a position to have to show up and have these conversations, this is not something that's always easy, but being able to do that in the best of your capacity is so important. And I guess that's why sometimes having good support can be helpful too, because the reality is sometimes speaking truth to power may mean that folks are at risk of losing their employment, right? And that may bring on additional stress financially, psychologically, on so many different levels, right? Sometimes people may feel that they're not able to speak truth to power for a variety of different reasons, right? But the more that we're able to be supportive, the more that we're able to kind of lean in towards each other, the more that it will be recognized that these types of micro and macro aggressions are just not acceptable or appropriate.
Great. Thank you. Well, thanks, Priya. That's great. There are a couple of other questions, but they're a little more general, and I'm thinking that maybe we can come back together with Iram at the end, and we can speak them. We can talk to them with both of you. So really appreciate the presentation. If there are any of those references that you want to put in the chat for people, I know they'd be greatly appreciated.
I'll do that right now. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.
Iram has joined us. Iram is a family doctor in Burnaby. She's on the board of the Burnaby Division of Family Practice. She has a panel that includes outpatients as well as long-term care practice, and she has experience in both the Canadian and U.S. healthcare systems. And her education is in the States, and she brings a fulsome perspective to this discussion. So, Iram, I'll turn it over to you. Welcome.
Thanks, Jeff. So as Jeff mentioned, I did my residency in the States, and so racism was a little bit more in your face there, I would say, in my experience as a resident physician. Specifically, you know, I would have patients who would express discomfort at having a Muslim female provider, for instance. And, you know, you also saw the effects of systemic racism in terms of the African-American indigent patient population that our residency primarily served. In Canada, you know, especially in British Columbia, my experience has not been the same, which is good, but also, you know, just because it's not happening to me doesn't mean it's not happening to other folks. You know, specifically, my particular patient panel in my community, in my clinic at Metrotown, is very diverse. You know, I have First Nations patients, I have Syrian refugees as patients, you know, multiple different communities and multiple different backgrounds, multiple different social walks of life. You know, one of the things that I identified kind of in the Lower Mainland community specifically was the LGBTQ population, specifically the transgendered population, was having a hard time finding family physicians that would, you know, accept them as patients for whatever reason, you know, lack of experience or lack of comfort. And so this was something that I actively strove to encourage in my particular clinic. So, you know, we have signage that, you know, clearly states that we're a safe space for all people, all LGBTQ patient populations. I put my name out with TransCare BC to make sure that you know, folks were aware that I'm a provider who is friendly towards trans patients, and you know, thankfully TransCare BC was quite supportive in connecting people with me. I guess what I would say is the best thing for us to be anti-racist allies is to be active. You know, we can always be reactionary to a situation where, you know, a racist incident happens and then we react to it, but it's also better, especially in this day and age where we're talking about it more, to be proactive. So that could involve, you know, putting up signage that allows, that lets people know that this is our philosophy, this is our work culture. So it starts inculcating an anti-racist environment from the very beginning. And, you know, folks may not necessarily be in a position of power to implement that, but that could come from, you know, the ground level as well. That you could approach somebody in power, in leadership, for instance, to facilitate those sorts of messaging and that sort of culture. In terms of, you know, folks who either experience racism themselves, especially microaggressions, which are really sometimes hard to pinpoint or like hard to nail down, I would say. I think it's really important to, you know, keep a log or keep details of what happened, you know, and how it affected the person, especially if it was somebody, if it directly affected you, for instance. And then, like Priyanka was saying, reaching out and seeking therapy and, you know, trying to understand what just happened is also really, really important. But I would say that, you know, with anti-racist work, there's two halves to it. One is reacting to situations as they arise, but the other is to also just be proactive about it and create a psychologically safe culture for all people. That's my bit.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Iram. And I want to dig into that a little bit. I think that kind of goes to, and actually, Priya, you'd be welcome to come back and join this conversation as well. I think that one of the questions was around this, around this cultural change that's necessary to take place. And it kind of goes, one of the things that Priya said, was, it was just being clearly that there's no gray zone. And really what I hear you say, Aram, is not only is there no gray zone, but you need to declare where you are. There's an opportunity, and I guess I think it's interesting that it's really come to the point where we seem to be in a place where it's, if you don't declare where you are, you may be perceived to be racist in some ways. And I think that, but the opportunity to create culture, Priya, you talked about creating culture, and signage. I wonder, are there other ways that we can, in the workplace, try to create culture? You talked about it doesn't necessarily have to come from the leaders. What could service providers do to try to create that culture in the workplace? Are there any things that people could take away?
So the first thing that comes to mind to answer this question is what I was saying before as well, is that we have a responsibility to stay informed, and to sort of know what's happening in the world, and that's hard to do. I will say that, right? Because sometimes the information that's going out there is really heavy to hear, right? Let alone experience. But just hearing about it and processing it and carrying it with us is challenging. But it doesn't take away from our responsibility of needing to keep ourselves informed about what's happening, right? That's the first thing that I would say. The second thing that I would say is, we have a responsibility to instigate and participate actively in these conversations when they're coming up. I find that a bit of an old school way of thinking, and sorry for using that unprofessional word, but a bit of kind of a previous way of thinking was that sometimes it wasn't really appropriate to talk about these issues in a team meeting, or we want to kind of leave those conversations out of the workplace. But that's not where we're at right now, and we need to be more active in bringing it in, and encouraging these conversations, because again, it goes back to that idea I was talking about before, is, when we demonstrate and actively make an effort to make sure people are seen and heard and begin to model that ourselves, we also, again, create that culture of community that I was talking about before. And that very much is our responsibility. So to have these conversations, to kind of talk about it, and you know what, but also being respectful. That's where it gets a little tricky, right? Is also knowing that we have our boundaries, and how much and how the way that we're going about it. I will encourage people to kind of use their own ability and judgment. That's obviously really important in these types of topics as well. But I would say that that's a starting point. And again, it circles back to what I was saying before, that it begins with us, right? We need to model it. We need to be, again, to demonstrate that this is what we're embodying, and what we promote will act as an example, not only for our clients, but perhaps even other people in our workplace as well.
And I think, I mean, I guess I have a question of some of the folks in the audience, if this is something that they've found, because I guess from my perspective, I agree with you. I mean, these are conversations that are not, they're no longer optional. They probably never were, but now they're just not optional. And I'm wondering if people are having a hard time having those conversations in the workplace, if there are, if it's something that could be better supported even. I mean, I will say, this is just kind of putting our primary care network hat on. We do things like the program that Priya is involved with, which are really directly client-based, but we also know that there's a need to help people who are the providers, and to help organizations, to support organizations. So we do wonder if there's something that could be helpful to I'm kind of liken it to there's a movement in the States around changing culture in death and dying, called the Kitchen Table Project, and basically it's just about bringing people to the table. And I wonder if there's things that we could do to support those conversations in a way that allows them to happen in a respectful way. I think your point, Priya, about people need to come to the table willing to be to show up. And if you drag them to the table, then that's not really where you want to get to. Iram, I have a question for you. I'm wondering, what do you see as the effects of racism on your patients? Can you speak to that? Or do you hear from your patients around the impact that they, particularly in their workplace or in their schools?
I do actually. So, I also work as a hospitalist in a multiple number of different settings. And so at the hospital, I'm able to witness it a lot more closely and more directly, I guess. And so some of the ways that it might get manifested is, pain control, for instance. There was an article I just read recently that healthcare providers would think that people of color experienced pain differently from their Caucasian counterparts. And so, pain medication wasn't being dispensed appropriately just because they thought that pain was being experienced differently, so to speak. Another thing might be that patient, especially if there's a language barrier, for instance, patient requests might get diminished or disregarded in a way, or not really addressed appropriately. And so those are some of the minor ways that I would say it kind of shows up in a healthcare setting. And so when that happens, and it's my patient, for instance, especially if there's a language barrier, I really, really try, and it's not always possible, I really try, to use translation services as much as possible to make sure that we're getting the patient side of things. Because oftentimes, because we're busy, it may not be possible to get a language translator every single time. But, I try my best. For instance, the nurses will also try oftentimes to get another nurse who speaks the language to address the concerns. And then if I'm noticing that, a patient's needs aren't being met, especially when it comes to pain control, for instance, it also does change my prescribing practices. So as opposed to making a pain medication as needed, I might make it a schedule thing, schedule sort of thing, just so that the patient ultimately is being served. Now that's sort of in the inpatient side of things. On the outpatient side of things, oftentimes my patients will, report difficulty either getting employment or keeping employment. There's also huge barriers with accessing social services, not because of, I wouldn't say because of racism per se, but it's the bureaucracy, the fact that it can be very difficult to access without the appropriate supports in place. So those are some of the ways that I see it manifesting in my clinic population. I haven't really heard too much about it with my, for my teenage patients, my LGBTQ patients really struggle quite a lot with mental health issues in the school setting. And this is something that, has kept some students out of school for long periods of time. Even when we connect them with mental health resources, it's not always effective. And so, systemic racism, unfortunately, is impacting, a lot of folks, a lot of patients, and we really got to do something about it.
Thank you. That's, yeah, absolutely. And that's, and I think it goes to Priya's point of it, we have to, and what are the steps that we can take individually? I have there's a question here, and I have a question for both of you. I think it's interesting. One of the, through the primary care network, we talk about this quite a bit in some of our working groups. And one of the things Yasmin from Fraser Health, who heads up their home health, was saying is the amount of racism that their care providers feel as providers. And I think that's, I mean, we talked mostly about how service providers, deal with racism that's inflicted upon their clients or in their workplace. But I'm curious if I know both of you have a lived experience. How do you what have you had to deal with, and how do you effectively deal with it? There's a question here about, somebody feeling as if they're being, she asked that they're denying being racist. People deny their racism and feel as if the person is being oversensitive. Can you speak a little bit to what it's been like for you in this environment, and how you deal with the racism you face? Which we maybe Priya, would you start? Are you okay? Yeah.
So I guess I'm trying to think of an experience that comes to mind. There's a couple of different ones. I'm just trying to figure out which one I want to share necessarily. I must say, in my career thus far, and even in school when I was in university, I think because maybe we're always around people who were social justice activists personally, or were striving towards being that. Everyone's really been very mindful, and where I work in Burnaby Mental Health, we're all service providers as well. So fortunately as well, lots of people who are very mindful. And that's the first thing that I do want to say, is that I really have noticed that people are doing their due diligence. And I think it's important to kind of, point that out as well, that people are kind of doing their best and really showing up in ways that are important. And could it be better? Yes, of course. But it's not like it's not happening at all. And I want to say that as well, because I do think that it's important. I think a lot of people often find that I hear this phrase passed around a lot, that, I'm not being racist, that's just my opinion. Right? I hear people say that, and that's something that I've heard personally before in different walks of life. I've heard people say that, I'm not being racist, that's just my opinion, right? But unfortunately, what I will say to that is when you're perpetuating racism, ultimately it's coming from discrimination. And when you're discriminating against somebody, it's not an opinion, right? So that's really kind of the point that it comes down to, is hatred and discrimination, where racism is typically bred from and where it lives. It's not necessarily an opinion, right? It's much more than that. And so I think that people tend to minimize that, and they get their hackles up, like, I'm allowed to have my own opinions, and I'm allowed to kind of feel the way that I feel, and nobody can tell me otherwise. And that's fair. Everybody is allowed to have their opinions. But when your opinions are perpetuating hate and discrimination, that's no longer an opinion, right? And so I guess to address, I think it's the Swinder who pointed that out. I know that's obviously a difficult conversation to have, and it's obviously difficult to frame it that way when it's a coworker who's kind of perpetuating these types of things, but that is very much the reality. Is that, we can have opinions about whether or not we want to put pineapple on pizza, right? That's an opinion. But about people, about human beings, and about opportunities, and whether or not somebody gets to advance in their career or not, or whether or not we're going to be prejudiced towards someone because of their skin color or the way that they look, that's no longer an opinion, right? So I guess, again, it comes down to that really black and white nature of this topic. And I know it's a sensitive one. It's not something that's easy for us to be talking about, despite the fact that we're actively doing this work. It's very vulnerable. It's very personal. But that's kind of what I would say to that, Jeff. I don't know if I really answered your question.
No, you did. I mean, you answered their question, and I think it's it's such a. I guess I mean, obviously, I come across. I'm an old white guy, and I've always considered myself to be anti-racist, and I obviously I still do, but this emergence in the way that the conversation is changing, and in a positive way, has forced me to really just take a step back and look at my own perceptions and where they come from, and hopefully that's a good thing that happens. But it does, honestly, I look back at the things that I've said and realized that at some point I was inadvertently doing something that could hurt somebody, and I think that's really hard to realize. So, Yerm, did you want to answer that question at all?
Yeah, in terms of the Swinder's question, a person who's claiming that you're being overly sensitive, I would frame that your response in a way that I know you may not be racist, but that your what you said or how you behaved had the perception of something, discrimination, or this is the effect that it had. The way that you felt isn't invalidated, basically. It's still valid. And I would just reiterate that, because somebody who's saying that you're being overly sensitive is saying that what you're feeling doesn't really matter. And that's not their place to say, essentially. So the way that I might reapproach that person is to try to separate the person from the behavior, because at least the behavior or the speech can be changed, whereas people tend to shut down if you just label them as a racist. Do you see what I mean? And once they begin to appreciate that, oh, their speech or their behavior did have this impact, and if you talk about the impact that it had on you, it's not, to be fair, it's not your job to have to educate somebody about this. But when you're in a situation like that, and if you feel comfortable doing that, then they might realize, hey, you know what, it was something that was a big deal, and they might hopefully come around. But that's how I would basically frame it.
Yeah, that's great. And it's funny you say that it's not your job, and that that's that comment that Priya, that you made earlier. We can't rely on our clients to educate us. It's that, and I think that's so that really tricky place. And on the other hand, on the other side of it, the worst place is where people put themselves and say, oh, I know how that would feel like. No idea, really, no idea. How do you strip yourself to that place where you go, I don't know, and I really like that place? And somebody else, I think Ryan made a point about, where you said the same thing, Iram. It doesn't matter. It's you, if you know that the impact of your words or your actions are harmful to somebody, that's really all that you need to know. And so what I hear you say, Iram, is that if there's anything you can communicate, it's that this hurts me. This is what you're saying or what you're doing is causing harm. And Priya, it kind of goes to your point. There's no opinion about that. It's whether it's right or wrong. It's not. This is not an opinion. It's if you're causing harm, you're causing harm. So I think that's. So we have just a couple minutes left, and I did want to review a couple of the sort of the resources that are available for folks before we go. But is there anything either of you would like to add just before we go? Priya, you're good. Iram, anything to say
I would just say, I'm so glad that we're having these types of conversations. I think, it's so important, especially that we recognize, all of us recognize our privileges, and, reach out to people and try to understand and appreciate where they're coming from. And, to not be afraid to call out what we know is wrong or what we know is hurtful. And just to always have, an open mind. We're all human beings. We're all prone to mistakes as well, but I think we all have the capacity for change. And ultimately, if we have the humility to proceed, that we're always learning, we can hopefully come to a greater understanding of each other.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you both, Priya and Iram. It's been so great to have you here. I will say, just to the audience, as we talked about this session, we came to realize that well, first of all, we understood that this is a start of a conversation, or a coming into a conversation. It's by no means an end of a conversation. But it's we also talked about, we've been doing these doc talk formats as sort of the way we're doing this now as speaking to an audience. And really, there's a real opportunity to have a more inclusive conversation. And I can tell it's been so great to have folks from the audience really participating. And I think if we were to, I think there's valid reason to have further conversations, perhaps a little bit more focused around specific issues around support for service providers, but to do it in a way that's more of a conversation. So we may consider that. So, but again, Priya and Iram, I really appreciate it, and thank you again. And I'm actually going to ask Manny to put up that last slide for me that has some resources on it, some of them which you've already heard. Manny, can you do that for me? Or Andrea? There we go. Okay. And if you can just go to the last slide, there we go. Perfect, thank you. So again, just around the Doc Talks are sort of a presentation of the primary care networks. There is a website, www.burnabykoronavirus.com that talks about the work of the primary care networks in the time of the coronavirus, and it also shows all of the different social supports and working groups and all of the social supports that are available in Burnaby around a variety of different things and numerous mental health pieces. But I just wanted to point out the resources that were talked to. Priya talked a little bit about some of the PCN resources. If you need a doctor or a counselor, or if your clients need a doctor or a counselor, then there is a place through the link that's up there to attach to a doctor. There's also the Urgent Primary Care Center at Edmonds, and you can go there and you can get some of the services referred through that center as well. I want to point you to the Burnaby Together, a Coalition Against Racism and Hate site. It has a huge amount of resources around racism in the workplace, in the community, and it has an ongoing number of sessions and engagement processes and information and support through that site. And as part of that, there's a place where you can report incidents of racism. I strongly encourage you to do this. We obviously, through the conversations that we're having now, through the conversations that have been happening over the last year, the issue of racism has risen, but it hasn't risen to the surface. It's still, I think I talked about that. The uncomfortableness of seeing a racist act and not knowing what to do, and therefore not doing anything. And even if you're not in the workplace, but particularly if you are, if you report it, it makes the issue more real. Honestly, you don't have to put your name down if you don't want to. All you need to do is say, this is something that happened, and you can provide information that will help, that will lead to supports for the incident, and that's also obviously extremely important. And then the last one is that there is an anti-racist community resource guide. Again, it's through Burnaby Together. There's an awful lot of information in there. There's an awful lot of work. I guess I would say, just when I listen to Priya, when I listen to Iram, I think if there's one takeaway, there's a couple of takeaways. One, it's don't stay silent, and two, it's create a culture of anti-racism in your workplace, because those are the foundational pieces that will actually make and bring change together. Anna Maria from Bustamante from Burnaby Together has just posted something. There's a town hall on Black, Indigenous, and people of color voices and on racism and how to be anti-racist on November 17th between 6 p.m. and 8 p.m. And you have to register. So you can go to that site, the Burnaby Together site, and you'll be able to do that. So we're at time. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did, certainly. It was a great conversation. Again, thank you to Priya and Iram and for stepping in as you were meant to be just a third, and you were each a half or more, and so much appreciated. Thank you, everybody. This link will be will be posted on the website as well, and we will send out a copy to all of the participants. So thank you very much. Take care.